Well, good morning, everybody. Hope all of you are doing well. We are continuing our series called The Big Picture. And the whole idea of this is that we're separating the Bible out into 8 different acts, like taking the Bible as a kind of drama or play, and then we're seeing 7 themes or motifs that run from the first pages of the Bible all the way to the last pages of the Bible. But what we're seeing is one grand unified story. Now, we've already talked so far about the first 3 acts of the story. We've talked about Eden, election, and Exodus. And we've seen these 7 themes run through each of those acts. I want to do a little bit of a review, but I'm going to put a time marker in this video so that you can see when Act 4 starts. So this part is review, and it might help you refresh on things we've talked about so far. But if you already remember what we've talked about, you can skip ahead to see how Act 4 plays out. But first of all, we start with Act 1, which is Eden. And this covers Genesis 1 through 11. We see that God creates a good world. And that good world is almost like a cosmic temple. It's built in 7 days, just like Solomon's temple is built in 7 years. God creates this beautiful land called a garden, the Garden of Eden, and there are rivers flowing through it. It's an abundant land meant for Adam and Eve, who he creates, to flourish in that land. Now, he also blesses Adam and Eve. He says good words to them. He says that they are to rule. They're to have dominion over the whole world. They're to be stewards in God's kingdom. So God is ultimately king, but Adam and Eve share in God's kingdom as long as they obey one command, which is to not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This is a part of God's covenant with Adam and Eve. They can enjoy the garden. They can have access to all of this life, this abundant life in the garden. But they can't pick from that tree. That's the one prohibition for the Garden of Eden. Now, what's important to know about their rule in this kingdom and share in God's kingdom is that they're supposed to rely on God's wisdom, not on wisdom from any other source. That's the reason why God says, don't pick from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's seeking wisdom elsewhere other than God. Now, they are deceived by a cunning or crafty or wise serpent. Now, the Bible is not saying that this satanic figure of the serpent in the garden is wise in the godly sense, but wise in an evil sense, misusing wisdom to deceive Adam and Eve. So they rely on their own wisdom, they take from the tree that they're not supposed to, and then they start to see how God's kingdom is something that they're losing. They're ruled over by the serpent. God exiles them to the east. We see that evil kind of spirals out of control with violence and death reigning from Genesis 3 through 11. Now, God does judge the world through a flood. That's the story of Noah. But God doesn't give up on the world. God saves Noah and his family and renews the covenant that he made with Adam and Eve with Noah. He's starting over again. He's continuing with humanity. He's not giving up on them. But we end in Genesis 11 with the following. We have many stories of humanity's sin from Genesis 3 through 11. We see many nations speaking many different languages. But what will God do next? How will God enter into this mess and bless us? How is he going to do that? Well, we see how that plays out in Acts 2, which is we're calling election. And that's a reference to God's picking or choosing Abraham to bless him so that he is a blessing to the rest of the nations. God doesn't just generically bless all of the nations. He picks one family through whom he's going to bless all other nations. And we see a story in Genesis where God makes a unilateral, one-sided covenant with Abraham. Abraham is asleep the entire time. But God says that he's going to bless Abraham, make him a great nation. His descendants are going to be like the sand on the seashore. He isn't even going to be able to count how many descendants he has. And there are going to be kings, a kind of royal line that comes through Abraham. So again, we see covenant extended from Adam to Noah to Abraham. We also see a lot of foolish decisions. This is not an explicit reference to wisdom, but we see the consequences of people's actions play out through the generations. So we see multiple times that there are sibling rivalries that take over and dominate family dynamics. We see how Jacob's deception ends up backfiring on him, and he is deceived by his uncle Laban. Over and over and over, we see how this family of Abraham, although it bears the covenant that God gives to this family, they're still deceptive. They're still wicked. They still sin like anybody else. And we see the family kind of unravel and face the consequences of those sin throughout their life. However, already by the end of Genesis, we see that God's promises are already being fulfilled. Abraham's family is getting much larger. We started out with Abraham and Sarah who couldn't have children. And now Jacob, his grandson, has 12 sons, all of whom get married and have children. So this family is expanding. We also see that God's promise for a royal line is actually being partially fulfilled by Joseph, one of Abraham's descendants. He is second in command in Egypt. And not only is he blessing Egypt, he's also blessing the Israelites. We see that God's blessing to the world through this one family is already taking place. Joseph saves Israel and his family from famine. But at the end of Genesis, in chapter 50, the Israelites are in Egypt. They're not in the land that God promised them. They've actually wandered away from God's promised land. So Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden. Cain was driven away from the land, and we see kind of this progression east away from Eden, further and further from this abundant land. So then God promises the land of Canaan to Abraham. But by the end of Genesis, we're not even there. We're not close to the promised land. We're all the way in Egypt. That leads us to Acts chapter 3. This is the Exodus. Now, the new Pharaoh, the new ruler of Egypt, sees the multiplying of Israel not as a fulfillment of God's promise, but as a curse. He thinks that if the Israelites grow in number and their enemies attack Egypt, then the Israelites could team up with their enemies and kind of defeat them from within. So he decides to enslave the Israelites. But God remembers his covenant. This doesn't mean God forgot his covenant. It means God is acting upon the promises he made to the Israelites. So, as he promised Abraham, whoever curses you, I will curse. He sends plagues upon Egypt, and he's trying to convince Pharaoh to let his people go. But each time Pharaoh hardens his heart, he doesn't listen to God, and he maintains the slavery of the Israelites. Eventually, God wears him down through all of these plagues and delivers God's people all the way through the Red Sea and to Mount Sinai. This is where God makes the covenant with Moses makes a covenant with Moses and the Israelites through the Torah, or the law. Now, God is not just giving them a law to be a burden or to make them disappointments. This is a gift. This is a clear way of life to keep a right relationship with God and with each other. God is making a kind of divine family where they know how to relate to their Heavenly Father as well as relate to others. This is perfectly summarized in the two greatest commands that Jesus references. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. That's what God is doing. He's helping them understand how to love him well as God and love each other well. That's what the law is all about. But this covenant is a two-way street. They agree to this covenant, and they say that they're going to follow all of these commands. Now, we know where that's headed because we've grown up reading the Old Testament, but that's the agreement. This is different than the covenant that God makes with Abraham, which is unilateral or one-sided. God's covenant with the Israelites at Mount Sinai is a two-way street. We see later on in Deuteronomy that Moses says that there's going to be curses that fall upon you if you disobey the law. It's inherent to disobedience that you suffer the consequences. You feel the pain and suffering that comes when you don't follow God's law. So that's the flip side of the blessing of the law, is the curses that come with it when we disobey. Again, we see throughout Exodus through Deuteronomy 34, that's the kind of the rest of the first 5 books of the Bible, we see that the Israelites are still not in the land. This is incredible. Genesis 12 was when God promised the land to Abraham. But still, due to their sin, due to their fickleness, due to their unreliable characters, God continues to punish them and say, you're not going to experience the land yet. And at the end of Deuteronomy, we're just waiting for them to enter into the promised land. Now, I want to mention one thing that we may not have covered in previous weeks. Moses says to the Israelites in Deuteronomy that when they go into the land, they're going to want a king. He anticipates this. And so what he does is he describes what kind of king they should want and desire and search for. However, we see, and we're getting a little foreshadowing, that all of the kings of Israel, north or south, do not live up to this expectation. Human kings, when they are meant to replace God or when they disobey God, ultimately fall short of that standard that Moses sets. And so we already see a foreshadowing that no human king is going to live up to God's standard. So how is he going to share his kingdom with a people whose kings always fall short of his standards? That's going to come up later. But right now, we see kind of the major themes so far play out, right? So we see God choose a particular family to bless the nations. He's going to make them a kind of kingdom. We see in Exodus that God says you're a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. And so we're seeing this expansion of this family and God blessing the world through this family. But they're not in the land that God promised. Still, we're waiting for that promise to be fulfilled. All right, that's the review. And now we're going to go into the next act, which is Act 4, the entrance into the land. All right, so if you've just jumped to this, we are covering Act 4 in the 8 big acts of Scripture. And this is the entrance into the Promised Land. And this is covering a lot of biblical material, okay? So we're talking about Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. So we are covering a lot of ground. So we're going to have to zoom out and see this story from a 30,000-foot view, okay? So this is the kind of general outline and narrative of what happens in this section. So first of all, we see Joshua. This is right after Deuteronomy and right after Moses has died and right after Moses has given them instructions about conquering the land. Joshua takes over leadership for the Israelites and he leads them by God's power to conquer the land. However, it's important to know that this conquest of the land is very incomplete. It is not the desired conquest that God set out from the beginning, and that's in many cases due to the Israelites. So we see a kind of letdown by the end of Joshua. The whole land has not really been conquered, and more importantly, the Israelites are teaming up with or succumbing to the temptations of their Canaanite neighbors. They're following into, moral corruption with them. We see that they sometimes go as far as worshiping their idols and their gods. So we see that the intent of the conquest of the land and the promised land itself doesn't actually come to pass. We see that God provides victories for them, but they're not all victories. Then we see a kind of downward spiral in the era of the Judges. Now, there's a kind of cycle that happens in Judges. So the Israelites will fall into sin. They'll worship the idols of their neighboring Canaanites. Then God will say, okay, you can have it your way, and you can face the consequences of your actions. And so what happens is those Canaanites oppress the Israelites. That's the natural tendency for us, right? When we worship and bow down to other gods, we become slaves to those gods. And so God lets the consequences of those actions happen to the Israelites, but then they cry out to God for help. And so God sends a judge, which we shouldn't really think of kind of a courtroom judge. We should think of a military leader, someone to take over and assist the Israelites in freeing them from oppression. God uses that judge, however wicked some of the judges really are. God works through those judges to deliver the Israelites from the Canaanites. But what happens is, what happens next, right? They fall into temptation and the cycle happens over again. And so we see this kind of downward spiral throughout Judges. And when you read the last chapters of Judges, you will be shocked at what happens. The Israelites descend into such moral decay, it's not even comfortable for me to read those chapters out loud. They are so bad, and they demonstrate how corrupt and evil the Israelites have become. There's a phrase that happens throughout Judges: they did what was right in their own eyes. This is the sin of Adam and Eve all over again, right? Adam and Eve pick from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They decide what's right and wrong on their terms. And this is what the Israelites are doing with the judges. They do what is right in their own eyes. They think they're doing the right thing, but it's because they've called evil good and good evil. However, I don't know if you know this, but the book of Ruth begins by saying, in the midst of the time of the judges, we hear about this family form with Ruth and her husband Boaz. This is the beginning of the family of David. So in the midst of all the chaos of the judges, we see a family form between a Gentile woman and a noble Israelite man that ends up giving to us King David. That will set us up for future books. After the chaos of the judges, we end up in a time where the Israelites are asking for a king. Now, the Bible is kind of ambiguous about kingdom. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. But the basic response is God mourns the fact that the Israelites want to replace him with a human king. Then we end up in the three major kings. I would call these the three major kings of Israel, and the rest kind of lower in importance. First we have Saul, then we have David, whose story began actually right here, and then David's son, Solomon. Now, this is kind of the overview of the story, and the major cast includes Joshua and his famous story with Rahab, the Canaanite who helps Joshua and his troops. We see the time of the judges, people like Samson, Gideon, and Deborah. You probably grew up hearing their stories. Eli is the predecessor to Samuel, who's a prophet during the time of Saul and David. And then Nathan follows after Samuel as a prophet during the time of David. Then we follow into Solomon story, which obviously comes from David and his wife Bathsheba. Okay, these are some of the main characters. Now, there are a lot more, but we can't cover them all. Now, I want to talk about the major themes that we see in the entrance to the land. Okay, so first we see land is so crucial to this part of the biblical story. Israel is finally in the land. However, we come up with all these questions. How do we face the reality and devastation of the conquest? So I wanted to talk about a few things to kind of clarify some confusion about the conquest of the land, because we as 21st century readers can read that and be horrified about what happens, and we need to take that seriously. So first of all, there's a common kind of understanding of this part of the biblical story as genocide. However, we read multiple stories where the Israelites are open to the Gentiles. We see Rahab assist the Israelites and join their community. We see the Gibeonites who become part of the Israelite community. So God is not ordering Joshua and the other Israelites to kill them based on their ethnicity or tribal background. Clearly, God is open to the Gentiles. We also see that God instructs them in Deuteronomy to make offers of peace at first. Okay, so this is not a genocide, even though it's sometimes cast as that way. Also, we need to clarify that these cultures were not purely innocent cultures. They were often very morally corrupt and regularly practiced child sacrifice. That's mentioned throughout Scripture, and we need to take that into account. These are not noble cultures that we should honor in all their respects. There's deep corruption and decay in these cultures. Third of all, this entrance into the land and all of the language surrounding it is not exact, but often exaggerating. And here's what I mean. Sometimes Joshua, we're told in the book of Joshua that all the people in a certain city were killed or conquered. And it'll say it was totally destroyed and we totally defeated everything and we annihilated them. However, we can find out that a few chapters later, there are still people from those cities that are intermingling and intermarrying with the Israelites. So clearly, this language is a kind of rhetorical exaggeration. It's hyperbole. It's not always meant to be specific or exacting. I also want to talk about some of the language surrounding the war, because in Deuteronomy 7, Moses is telling the Israelites what it's going to be like to conquer the land. And he says, when you drive out the many nations before you, you must destroy them totally. Okay, so that's Moses' first injunction. Then he says, make no treaty with them. Then he says, don't intermarry with them. And then he says, break down their altars. And then he says, break down their stones and their Asherah poles. Okay, so this doesn't really make sense if you're starting with the very first thing, right? If he says, destroy them all, Joshua, when you go into the land, kill every single person, but then 4 commands later says, don't intermarry with them, that doesn't make sense. Clearly, you can't intermarry with people that died in battle. So I think the deepest concern here is idolatry. The deepest concern is that the Israelites would intermingle with the Canaanites and worship their gods, and then they kind of work backwards. So the language of destroying them all is a kind of exaggeration that is built off the major concern, which is idolatry. I also think that this is not a universal situation we find ourselves in. This is a unique moment in history. God specifically promised Abraham the promised land of Canaan. And that is not meant to be an all-time, all-place. Whenever Christians read that passage and justify all of our, violence in the past, I don't think that's necessarily justified, because this is not a universal situation we find ourselves in. This is a unique situation. And finally, this is not the land that they conquer is not arbitrary, in the sense that the Israelites don't view themselves as an empire where they can continue to expand and continue to conquer. God sets very specific boundaries and says you should not go past these. Okay? Now, that doesn't perfectly explain all the difficulties with the land, but I think it's really important to address those. Also, we see the covenant continued throughout this whole process. Joshua tells the Israelites to remember the covenant that they made with God. They have this whole ceremony that actually kind of reaches back to the themes of the Exodus. When Joshua crosses the Jordan, it parts, just like the Red Sea parted for Moses. We see the tabernacle go through the Jordan River with them. We see that they practice circumcision and they practice the Passover feast. So this is all kind of leading them back to remember, okay, God delivered us out of the land of Egypt through water, and we got circumcised and we celebrate the Passover, but now we're crossing through water into the land. God is going to be involved in this whole process. He is leading this battle, and we need to remember our covenant with him. However, after the time of Joshua, we see that the judges do not remember the covenant. They do what is right in their own eyes. We see the covenant themes continued, where the kings, all of the kings that are chosen for Israel, they need to remember the covenant. They need to remember the Torah, but they don't. We see that so often they disobey. And finally, the last kind of theme with God, with the idea of covenant, is that God makes a very specific covenant with David. Okay, so far we've seen God make covenants with Adam and Noah and Abraham. He extended that covenant through Isaac and Jacob and the whole family of Israel. He remembered that covenant in the Exodus. He made a two-way covenant with Moses at Mount Sinai, and now he's making a covenant with David about his dynasty. He is going to have a descendant who is going to reign as king forever. That king is going to be called the Messiah. This is crucial to understanding the New Testament. We also have the theme of temple, okay? So in the last act, we saw the creation of the tabernacle, and God fills the tabernacle with his presence in the Holy of Holies. However, we see now that the Israelites sometimes try to manipulate God by using the ark. Now remember, the ark is kind of a sacred, gold, ornate, beautiful chest, and it can be carried on 4 poles by 4 different men and carried from place to place. It's not supposed to touch the ground. It's that holy, okay? Now, the Israelites one time lose a battle. They lose a battle against the people of the land, and so they decide, we're going to manipulate God. We're going to put the ark of God out in front of us, and that's going to make our victory secure over our enemies. And guess what God does? God says, you are not going to manipulate me. And they lose that battle again, and the ark is stolen. This could not be a bigger deal for Israelites at the time. This is massive. The ark of God, the place where God's presence resides, has been stolen. However, the Philistines bring that Ark of the Covenant into their temple next to their God, and we see that God says, you are not going to manipulate me to them. One of the statues of their gods breaks down. We see that the Philistines experience plagues, and the ark is sent back. They're like, we do not want anything to do with this Ark of the Covenant. Okay, so this is really important. Even though God instructs them to make this tabernacle and to make the Ark of the Covenant, and his presence is going to be there with them. It's like a little mobile temple for God. Even though that's important, they cannot use that then to manipulate God. God's presence resides with them, but he's not going to be manipulated by them. Now, ultimately, after many efforts on David's part, the Ark of the Covenant, which is the kind of mobile temple, comes into Jerusalem, and Solomon, not David, creates the temple. Now, if you go back and read all of the instructions about the tabernacle and the temple, you'll see tons of parallels. Basically, what's happening is now we're creating a permanent tabernacle, right? The tabernacle was meant for wandering in the wilderness, right? When they're moving around a lot and they're making their way towards the promised land. But now that they've conquered Jerusalem, they need a permanent temple. And so they create a kind of perfected and larger version of the tabernacle called the temple. And that's what Solomon creates. And God's glory fills that temple. The other theme we see is the theme of family. Again, the Israelites are growing in number. Their tribes are almost becoming nations unto themselves. And we see when Joshua conquers the land that the last part of Joshua is really just dividing up the land for the Israelites. We're seeing God's blessing come true. Finally, we've been waiting for it very long, and now we're seeing it come to pass. We're seeing the idea of inheritance. We're seeing the idea of Abraham, this promise that was made to him, being fulfilled for his descendants. We also see the theme of family with David's own family, which receives its own book in the Bible. But we also see lots of royal families fall apart. We see David's family fall apart, Solomon's family fall apart. And we're seeing a lot of intertribal conflict, and that happens in the theme of family. The theme of blessing is not as prominent in this section, but it's still very important. We see that Joshua reads the blessings and curses just like Moses did at the end of Deuteronomy. And we see how important those blessings and curses are. That when the Israelites disobey, when they disobey God's covenant, they're going to experience a curse. However, it really is difficult to see how the Israelites are a blessing to the nations around them, just like God promised Abraham in the midst of the conquest. This is a difficult question that all of us have to wrestle with. How is Israel blessing nations by conquering them? It's a difficult question that we all need to struggle with. Finally, two more themes for this act. Obviously, kingdom becomes very important in this section. Joshua and his armies defeat the foreign kings in conquest, but the creation of Israel's kingdom is quite ambiguous. We see that God clearly cares and thinks it's wrong that the Israelites want a king to replace God. They want to be like the nations around them. And so they want a king to represent them. And we see how in Saul, who is this tall, strapping young man, comes to show us and be symbolic of the king who is good on the outside, who has a kind of outward appearance of greatness, but on the inside, his character is very deeply flawed. However, we do see that there is a kind of strand of celebration of the King of Israel if that King of Israel is humble in heart, who cares about God's Torah and his law and follows his commands and trusts in him. However, ultimately, we do see the rise and fall of each of the three major kings. Saul starts off really strong. We see that he defeats the enemies of Israel. But by the time of David, he is becoming a madman and a murderer, an attempted murderer. We see that David in the beginning trusts in God. He fights Goliath with courage and bravery. But we see at the end of his life, after he sleeps with Bathsheba and doubles down on all of his evil actions with her, we see that his family just becomes a mess. And he ends up on the throne after his own sons try to supplant him. David's son Solomon comes to power, and we see this fantastic story at the beginning where he trusts in God to give him wisdom. But at the end of his story, he becomes a lot more like Pharaoh than any Israelite king should be. He subjugates his own people. He marries many women from foreign nations to create political ties. And the kingdom, we see, it has these beginnings of greatness. We see Saul and David and Solomon have these good beginnings, but they don't finish well. Each of them fall into corruption and they disobey God. Finally, we see the theme of wisdom. Clearly, the famous story of Solomon asking wisdom from God is actually a callback to Adam and Eve in the garden. Solomon asks for the knowledge of good and evil, but he asks for it from God, and God gives it to him. So God gives him godly wisdom. That same exact phrase, good and evil, shows up both in Genesis 1 through 3 and in Solomon's stories. We also see the creation of many of aspects of wisdom literature, like Psalms and Proverbs, Job and Song of Songs or Song of Solomon. We see the beginnings of this wisdom literature. When the kingdom is flourishing and there are good rulers, it's because they have gained wisdom from God. So we're going to talk about this more later, but those are the 7 themes. Let me know if you have any questions about this act of Scripture. It's one of the most intriguing, it's full of political intrigue. It's has so many stories that we couldn't cover, but I think these themes are so important because they set us up to know that the kingdom of Israel is falling apart. God promised them the land, and he promised to rule over them in the land, and they could partake in his kingdom there, but they are trusting human kings. And human kings, when they come to power, they will always disappoint. They will always fall short. And so God is going to send them prophets. We're going to talk about this next. But these prophets are meant to warn Israel. If you don't change your ways, if you don't repent, if you don't trust in God, this kingdom is going to fall apart. We see the beginnings of this kingdom crack. We see that the kingdom is not going to last, and we're going to see how that plays out in Act 5, which is called exile.